doomsday scenario. What do you make of it? Overstated and perhaps a lack of understanding of how the economy works?
Well, let's start with, yes, there will be disruption in the software industry, that AI will replace a lot of the routine coding. Maybe all the stuff that still sort of works with COBOL will get replaced. But yes, as Menaka just said, you will need people to supervise the deployment. Yes, my daughter can do vibe coding, but that doesn't mean she can handle the massive systems for a large enterprise and ensure that that works really well, because what you need is no errors in some of these large systems. So somebody will have to do that. Presumably, India's software firms will employ AI as they retool themselves, reskill themselves for a new future. So one is, it sort of assumes a straight line. These big dinosaurs can't change. They will not use some of the AI tools that are there. We already see some of them sort of signing up with Anthropic, with OpenAI to use those tools. So that's one. The second is what is traditionally called the lump of labor fallacy, that there is only so much work, and that if you have new tools, that work will be, most of it will be automated, and there'll be a lot of unemployment. What we've seen again and again is if work becomes more productive, cheaper, there's more of it. More firms will use software in new, different ways, and so you would expect that to change also. But the reality is true that that we've seen very little hiring in the software sector. To Menaka's point, 8 million jobs a year, that's not, the software sector has been providing some, especially higher-end jobs, but it counts even now for about 8 million jobs in India overall. And so the Indian services story can still persist in many other areas outside of software. But yes, AI will be a challenge.
In terms of how it will disrupt the sector, how do you see that playing out, Professor? And, what kind of steps, moves should the government adopt to ensure that the worst-case scenario does not play out?
Well, first, I think early days, this is not at this point something that calls for government action. I think what the big software firms have to do is incorporate whatever AI they can throughout their systems so that they increase productivity. They're already doing it with some of the tools that already exist, but they have to keep abreast of AI as it comes out and convince their clients across the world that they're getting the best of software at the cheapest point possible. That may mean, muted hiring. We've seen TCS already say that it's going to lay off a bunch of people. You're going to see silent layoffs in a bunch of other software firms. They may not announce it so clearly. And it also means that many of their employees have to retool really fast. But this is not something they cannot overcome. And if, in fact, the cost of their services becomes cheaper, maybe they get more business. Remember that many firms in the U.S. and across the world have yet to implement AI in a big way in their processes. So I think there's a lot of work yet to come in rolling things out. For example, using the data that your processes generate in firms, putting AI to work in improving processes based on the data collected and outcomes. That is something that needs to be done, and that's where software firms that India has can play a big role.
Professor Rajan, technology rarely works in this linear, speedy fashion, as at least the Citrini report has visualized. Can you talk us through what you have seen happen when large technology shifts have taken place, especially in countries like India, the time it took to move to a software economy, the time it took to move to a digital economy, and then therefore the time it will take to move to an AI economy?
I think you put your finger on the nail here, which is really you see the fastest use of technology in the people creating the technology. So sometimes there is a sense that this is going to move really, really fast. What they don't see is adoption outside the frontier sort of is much longer. I remember an Economist article, and I may have the dates a little wrong, but they're talking about the development of the telephone exchange without human operators. And it actually was invented in the 1920s. But the last human operator was taken out in the United States in the mid-1980s, so around 60 years for the technology to be fully rolled out. Things take time, and the firms that are not technology savvy will take more time. That said, I think in industry after industry, everybody's looking at each other to see who's going to roll out AI in an effective way sooner rather than later. And everybody's waiting for the Barnes and Noble moment, so to speak, when suddenly the industry sort of sees there's a faster, cheaper way of doing it. That's when Amazon came into the book business, and the old dinosaur Barnes & Noble goes out of business. But for every industry, it can be different. It can be a different application of technology. We're seeing some of it, for example, in payments. We saw Block announce, for example, it was laying off 4,000 people. Now, many of those may be in software development, which is the frontier industry right now where much of the change is happening. But rolling out into, more plain vanilla industries may take more time. And I think that will allow many industries time to adjust, but also time to use AI rather than just be displaced by it.
Okay. Also, Professor Rajan, from a macroeconomic policy point of view, you've been a proponent of services-led growth in India. But do you now feel in hindsight, as we see this technology play out, that it will impact white-collar jobs more than blue-collar jobs, especially the top-level white-collar jobs, and therefore by doubling down on manufacturing, even if it meant through incentives and subsidies, the Modi government's policies are broadly in the right direction, even when it comes to the heavily subsidized semiconductor mission?
I think that's completely incorrect in the sense that technology is going to reach the manufacturing sector also. It already has. And robotic technology is going to get better, is going to get more efficient. But also, protectionism is rife in the manufacturing sector. So we need all the manufacturing we can get. Don't get me wrong. India should do whatever it can do. But, to the extent of subsidizing really, really costly investment in things like chips without getting anywhere near the frontier, far better to redeploy that in training people, in our educational sector, in getting R&D going. It would be nice for India to have frontier AI models or frontier applications of AI. That requires improving the quality of our engineering, which is already pretty good. But the broader point I would make is services is a big area. Now, I think software is being hit now. It will change. The routine stuff will almost surely go, and that was on the cards. Legal discovery, ferreting through hundreds of thousands of pages of stuff in legal reports, that could be automated, is being automated. But I think the more sort of creative parts, actually making legal arguments, offering medical advice, of course, augmented by AI, but medical advice at a distance. These are areas that I think for some time will still continue. And of course, what you would hope is a lot of it would be augmented by AI. So I think the reason many firms are moving to India, because highly skilled service people, a consultant, is 1/5 or 1/6 the price of a consultant in the West. And that consultant in India has the same access to the tools, technology. And as you see from Indian advertisements, Gemini, OpenAI, ChatGPT, etc., advertising widely in India, I think this is leveling the playing field across the world. And India's labor cost advantage here makes a huge difference. So it's not just software, it's a whole variety of highly skilled services. But really, and let me end here, the thrust is not so much on the highly skilled services, but the moderately skilled services, carpentry, plumbing, which are really essential for urbanizing India. That's where the jobs are going to be, not necessarily in low-skilled manufacturing, within in many parts of the world is being automated away. So I think the services story still holds. The upper end will have to adapt, but the moderate end is where the jobs will be, and that is where we need much more skilling and training to create those jobs in India.
Professor, earlier you talked about how this will not happen quickly, it will not happen overnight. But if you take a look at the developments in AI, the capacities are doubling every 7-8 months. So it is a revolution. If governments don't take action now, put incentives in place, train their workers very quickly, they will lose out. I mean, what's being done? What needs to be done then for countries like India?
Absolutely. I mean, I agree that the time for action is now, but it's really in allowing or enabling people to adapt as best as they can, as quickly as they can. And this is where I think, Menaka brought up an important point. India is spending tens of billions of dollars in subsidies for chip manufacturing. Those tens of billions of dollars, if they went into our universities, both creating new ones, but augmenting the old ones. I was just back to my alma mater, the IIT, Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, which requires so much investment in order to give the kids in college right now a much better educational experience. I think investing in people is really the name of the game right now, whether at all levels, at the higher levels, but also in skilling the moderate levels. And that has to be done today, but not just in India. This is something the U.S. also should be thinking about. Let's not just point the finger at immigrants and the rest of the world, but let's look inwards and ask, is the United States, where 70% of workers are in the service industry, is the United States ready for the kinds of disruptions that will come? And no doubt, and you make an important point, that the disruptions will come. The pace we can argue about, but they will come, which is why we should react today in terms of public policy. And that is largely about enabling rather than disabling sectors.
Professor Rajan, how do you see the impact of this playing out on India's very large, medium-sized enterprise business sector? I feel like, the large top companies, the big conglomerates, the Adanis, the Ambanis, the Birlas, the Tatas will adapt, and will spend the money required. So far, some surveys seem to suggest that Indian companies are devoting only just about a fifth of their IT budgets, and these are the large companies, towards AI deployment of any kind or proof of concepts. But I'm concerned about the impact on India's middle sector. It is already an uncompetitive sector by many measures. Do you feel that this imperils that middle layer of growth significantly?
It's a great question. And I think this is where, if they could seize the opportunity, I mean, we talked about IT becoming much cheaper, data analysis and processing becoming much cheaper. So for many of these small and medium enterprises, to the extent that the IT firms, the software firms lose business outside, if they start sort of looking inwards and proposing sort of solutions to what some of these medium-sized enterprises to their processes, and at a price that they can afford, I think this would be wonderful in improving efficiencies right through the economy. So this is a potential opportunity. Let me give an example with medical. I've been talking to some people in the medical area in India, and they say many hospitals would benefit hugely from improving the quality of the data, from having a common database, et cetera, all the usual arguments. But they say they simply don't want to spend on IT. So Indian IT firms, when they go to offer medical sort of services to improve data and data analysis, they typically look looking to the rest of the world. There's a huge opportunity in India, and as you know, India has tremendous needs for medical services. So if they could refocus on some of the Indian hospital chains and so on, but give them services at a price they can afford, which they will be able to do once they're more AI enabled, I think there could be lots of opportunities. So yes, they do need to change, but it may be that change is easier when you look forward. I don't want to be entirely optimistic because change is a challenge, but I think there are possibilities here.
Can you wear your former central banking hat for me? And even if this technology were to play out in a far more drawn-out, volatile fashion than what this report seems to suggest, as a former central banker, how would you be looking at the correlation between productivity, wage growth, and inflation? What should we be watching out for play out in India over the next few years? And what should our central bank be prepared for at this point in time?
So on the issue of, let's assume the report comes true and there's massive layoffs in the software sector, et cetera. I mean, that's not something the central bank can actually do anything about because, lowering interest rates, but really there's a mismatch between the skills that people have in the software sector and the jobs available. That's not going to create a whole set of new jobs in the software sector. They'll have to migrate to other areas. And there, I think the central bank can only have modest effect. But that said,
Professor Rajan, sorry to interrupt you. But there is a collateral impact of a significant, let's say, a set of layoffs in the IT industry. It will play out in the real estate industry. It will play out on consumption, in India. Yeah. And so effectively, it will play out on growth as well, right? Because right now, it's only the top 300, 400 million people in India that are consuming to support this 7.4 or 7.6% rate of growth.
Right. So to the extent it plays out in the normal variables that the central bank looks at, absolutely, it'll have to do the usual stuff it does. What I was trying to say is it's not going to look at the sector alone and formulate policy as on that basis. It's going to look at the overall parameters that it usually looks at and formulate policy on that. Also, I think the issue for AI, I mean, we talked about the positive side, that there can be a lot of investment in India. Maybe not so much, we were already talking about massive data centers and so on. So there is a demand side boost possible from AI, even as the supply side also becomes more productive. And which effect dominates is really the question, whether in the US or in India. Does AI imply lower interest rates, or does AI imply higher interest rates? For now in the US, you might argue that you're seeing a lot of the demand side, the massive investment in AI data centers and so on, would tend to push up growth, but push up also the demand for capital. That would tend to imply higher interest rates. To date, despite the Citrini report and some early signs of layoffs, we haven't seen massive layoffs as a result of AI. So, the supply side effects are slower to some extent. We've seen some productivity increases, but they're probably not as much AI as other factors.
Professor,
so you don't
when
see
you take a look at the...
Sorry, Has.
Go ahead, Menaka. Go ahead.
I just had a follow-up, Has. You don't see this having a deflationary impact, in terms of growth in the Indian economy?
It depends on the offsets, right? Supposing it implies a whole lot of new investment that has to happen in India in order to react to the changes that AI demands. That could be demand positive. And so it need not be deflationary. We have to see which the greater supply side as a result of improvements in productivity, et cetera, versus the greater demand side. And of course, the external side effects that you're talking about from maybe less demand for software services. So it's more complicated than saying it would be directly deflationary. It depends on how everything else plays out.
Professor, when you take a look at the markets, foreign investors have been pulling money out because India, it seems, is a non-AI play, and now India is competing for AI investments with AI leaders the likes of Taiwan, Korea, even China. How do you think this might play out? Can India compete competitively?
I think India has to pick its battles. That was true of the chip industry, but it's also going to be true of AI, right? The kind of massive investment in foundational models seems something that big companies in the United States can afford, but whether it's something that will generate the returns over time is a big question mark. They're competing fiercely. And I think at this point, just as China is doing, rather than compete on foundational models, maybe it makes more sense to compete on applications as well as on derivatives of the foundational models, maybe grab some of the parameters and have smaller, more focused models. Ultimately, India needs appropriate AI technology, appropriate in the sense of being cheap enough for its firms to use. And I think focusing on those applications right now until the dust settles on which kinds of foundational models and how much becomes clearer. Maybe down the line, the technology for building these foundational models simplifies dramatically. And I think the idea that the train is leaving the station, if you're not on it, you're left behind, maybe that's not so true. But India needs to keep a watch and I think pick off the pieces that make most sense for it right now.
Professor, I'll be remiss not to ask about the Indian rupee, because the Citrini report did say that it expects the rupee to fall 18% versus the USD should that doomsday scenario were to take place. Your thoughts on where the rupee is headed and what should we be looking out for?
Well, I think, predicting exchange rates is a fool's game. Yes, if Indian exports collapse, the rupee will fall appropriately so at that point, because it makes sense to have more competitive industries. But we're very far from that right now. So let's not get overly wound up in science fiction and think that's the outcome. Again, it assumes a straight line. It assumes no adaptation. It assumes that there aren't new sort of businesses that substitute. I'm sorry, there's kind of disruption here. But anyway, I think that's. I don't foresee the rupee anytime soon collapsing at that rate. Let me stop there.